What up, Craig?
Hi, Craig.
Hi, Craig.
Hello, Craig.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Paddocks. We're just coming down from Silverstone weekend in England, so we thought it would only be fitting to do a cover spotlight on one of our fave Brits, George Russell. On the episode, we have Rachel, LeAnne, Melissa, and myself, Chelsea, and we're going to kick it off with a little background to his early days in karting with Mel.
Thank you, Chels. So, George William Russell, born on February 15th, 1998, our posh English king, was born in Kingsland, Norfolk. He grew up in Westbeck, Cambridgeshire, before moving to Milton Keynes to be closer to his racing team. George is the youngest of three, his older sister being Cara and his older brother Benji. George had begun karting in 2006 at the age of 7, thanks to spending majority of his time around tracks due to his older brother Benji, who also participated in competitive karting. Fun fact, George actually attributes his brother for the reason that he uses the number 63 as his race number in Formula One. Even George himself says that it's a family number since his brother raced under the same number during karting. After starting in karting, George progressed through the cadet class by 2009, becoming the MSA British champion and the British Open champion. There's also the infamous photo of George right behind Lewis, kind of looking up at him while Lewis is at McLaren at the Formula Kart Stars. And it was kind of like a form of a foreshadowing for the future. By 2010, George had moved to Rotax's Mini Max category, where he became the Super 1 champion and the Formula Kart Stars British champion, and Kartmasters British Grand Prix. I think we're starting to see a pattern here. George had then progressed on to KF3 by 2011, and there he won the SKUSA Super Nationals title, became the CIK FIA European champion, and was able to defend that title the following year in 2012. During his final year in karting in 2013, George finished in 19th in the KF1 CIK FIA World Championship.
Georgie Boy did do quite a bit in 2014, so I'm just going to jump right into everything. George graced the single-seater world with his presence in 2014, like I said. He had a partial season with Formula Renault 2.0. George originally was signed with Prema Power Team, but he made a last-minute change, and his debut in the Formula 2.0 Renault Alps Championship was with the Finnish team Koreanen GP. He placed fourth in this championship, even though he was sick while racing at Red Bull, because George doesn't stop, y'all. He just doesn't. And honestly, as a side curiosity comment, I truly wonder how often these drivers have flashbacks of them being like a younger racer, like just going to these tracks. And if they just have these flashbacks that are just like vivid, because I know I would, and all the memories would just come flooding back. So I truly like wonder how many of them are just like, remember when I was like 12 here? But anyways, back to Formula Renault 2.0. George had a quick little stint in the Euro Cup Formula Renault 2.0 championship. He competed in 2 rounds and had a little team change as well. He started in Moscow with Koreanen GP, but switched to the French team Tech 1 Racing in Jerez? Something like that. For the final round, where George was a guest entrant and won the final race of the season after starting from pole position. Now, see, like I said, he had a quick stint in Formula Renault 2.0, so here we are, already in Formula 4. George signed on with LeAnne Racing once he joined Formula 4. They were actually the reigning champions, and George was quoted saying that it was a privilege to join LeAnne and was confident that he could match or succeed their success from the previous season. He competed in BRDC Formula 4 Championship for them, and he entered the final race where he ended up in a 4-way title battle with his teammate Arjamani and the HCC Motorsports team, Senan Fielding and Raul Hyman. George started from pole that race and came out with a win, making it his 5th win that season. And as a little bonus, he won the championship as well, but only by 3 points over his own teammate. This win was actually Tech 1 Racing's first Euro Cup win, so it's safe to say he really did succeed their success from last season. Because George won that championship, he actually got the chance to test a GP3 car on the Abu Dhabi track, Yas Marina circuit with Arden Motorsports. Jumping to December of 2014, George won the McLaren Autosport BRDC award. He actually beat out a friendly face of the podcast, Alexander Albon. This made Russell the youngest ever to receive the award. Plus the added, 100,000 British pounds would have been my favorite part of the award. But along with the pounds, George also got a British racing driver's membership, along with a Formula One test with McLaren. George became the youngest ever recruit to join only 12 other drivers in the British Racing Drivers Club Superstars program, big mouthful of words, in February of 2015, which brings us right into his Formula 3 era. And our Taylor Swift queen, Rachel, is all about the era, so she's going to talk about that one.
So George joined Carlin, currently known as Roden Carlin, for the 2015 Formula 3 season. His first victory came at the season's opening round at Silverstone, where he finished ahead of Charles Leclerc, another familiar face, and teammate Antonio Giovinazzi in the second race of the weekend. He had 2 more podium places that season, one at Spa and one at the Nürburgring, with his final place in the championship being 6th. He was also the runner-up to Charles Leclerc in the rookie championship standings as well. And then in September of 2015, he competed in the Masters of Formula 3, which is a non-championship event held at Zandvoort. He qualified 4th and finished the main race in 2nd behind teammate Antonio Giovinazzi. He was also scheduled to compete in the Macau Grand Prix. However, shortly before the race, he was replaced with Japanese Euro Formula Open Championship driver Yu Kanemaru. And then for the 2016 season, he moved over to High Tech GP, and he finished 3rd in the standings, having scored 2 victories during the season.
By 2017, George had signed with the ART Grand Prix for DGB3 Series season, where he had previously driven for the team during the postseason testing at the Yas Marina circuit in 2016. From there, George was starting to make an impression in the series. George finished the weekend in 4th and 5th at the Circuit de Barcelona-Catalunya. The next race was at the Red Bull Ring. George got his maiden pole position for the race and first victory in the series itself. As the season went on, George began to gain an advantage in the championship by winning at Spa and earning 2nd place alongside earning fastest lap in both races held at the circuit, which I didn't know for these series. Side note, that they hold more than one racing event for the other series. I thought that was actually pretty cool. The following race was held at Monza, where we only saw one race occur due to the severe weather going on that weekend. And there, once again, he won the race with his teammate Jack Atkin and Antoine Hubert. Afterwards, George had claimed victory at 4 races, 3 pole positions, and 5 podiums. This put George in the position to claim victory at the Jerez, even though there was still one race to be held at the Yas Marina. By the end of the season, George ended up winning the 2017 GP3 series.
So in 2018, George was confirmed as a driver for ART Grand Prix that January for the Formula 2 season. During this time, he was also confirmed as one of the reserve drivers for Mercedes, which he shared that role with Pascal Wehrlein. In his debut round at Bahrain, he qualified 2nd, but he ended up finishing the race 5th for that opening round. The second round at Baku, George was leading the majority of the feature race, but due to a late safety car causing some issues at the restart, he was denied his maiden victory in that series. However, he made a pretty good comeback in the sprint race, having set the fastest lap and taking victory after starting 12th on the grid. He took his 2nd victory of the season and first maiden feature race win in Barcelona after battling it out with another familiar face on the grid this year, Nick de Vries. He then took 4th in the sprint race, which moved him up to 2nd in the championship standings. There was a bit of a rough patch after having an engine failure during free practice in Monte Carlo, which limited his running, and he qualified 16th and finished outside the points in 2 races. He still made yet another comeback at Les Castellets Paul Ricard in France, taking his maiden pole position and his 3rd victory of the season. George won the F2 title after a victory at the feature race in Abu Dhabi, and this made him the 5th rookie champion of the F2 category, a title that is also held by Nico Rosberg and current F1 competitors Nico Hülkenberg, Charles Leclerc, and Lewis Hamilton. In addition to that, he also became the fourth driver after Hamilton, Hülkenberg, and Leclerc to win the F3 and F2 titles in consecutive seasons, which is really cool.
And after his time in F2, we saw George finally get to his dream spot, Formula One. Now, when George Russell entered the Formula One world, Williams was experiencing a slump. This was a team that had been doing consecutive points and podiums up until like 2018 when they started coming in the end of the track. But, George thought this was a team that at the time could bounce back from this and they'll be back in P5 to P3 in a region of competitiveness. So he went ahead and he signed a multi-year contract with them. Before the season even began, Williams had issues with getting the car in on time for testing. They were late by like 2 or 3 days for the 8-day event, and they found themselves with a pace that left them at the back of the grid. I did find it odd that there was never an explanation for why the car was so late. The principal back then, Claire Williams, she said, "I'm not going to go into detail as to why that happened. I don't think it's appropriate to discuss the in and out of what went wrong." She was mostly just really apologetic and embarrassed about the whole thing, but the team itself seemed to handle the press well, and George didn't share any hard feelings. I also think George is just very well PR trained. There were some upgrades made throughout the season, but this really only moved George a few spots up in the quali field, and his highest finishing place for a Grand Prix was P11 at Germany, and this was because his teammate Robert snitched the P10 at the last minute during a wet race, and Robert got Williams their only point that season. So, sorry, George. George's biggest competition, though, was his own teammate, and it was really the best way to see George's talent, because George was out-qualifying and out-racing Robert pretty consistently, and George really enjoyed those small victories that season because he was the first F1 driver to out-qualify his teammate 21-0 in a season. While George may have ended the season P16 in the Drivers' World Championship, there were multiple people on the grid, including his own team principal, that said George had what it took to become a world champion driver. Now, in 2020, Williams is on time to practice, and George was pretty happy to mention that Williams' car was performing better than last year. However, I had no doubt that was possible because anything was better than last year. I did respect George for sharing that the car was still slow, probably wouldn't pass Q2, but he wasn't scared to drive the car now, so that is a plus. Sadly, though, this was all for nothing because the Australian Grand Prix and the following calendar was cancelled due to COVID-19. Now, don't worry, this doesn't stop Formula One from doing what it does best, and we got to see drivers like Alex Albon, Charles Leclerc, Zhou Guanyu, and of course, George Russell, join the Formula One Virtual Grand Prix Championship. If you didn't know, which I didn't, because I remember when this happened, I was very confused. This is a mini championship. It runs over 3 rounds. It's joined in by drivers we love, plus some other people in other motorsports and on the web. And they were racing for a prize fund that is entirely donated to charity. Now, the race consisted of tracks from Bahrain, Australia, Brazil, Spain, Monaco, Canada, and Azerbaijan. It does bring me absolute joy to say that George Russell would be crowned the winner with 146 points. We had Alex as a runner-up with 108, and we had Charles in third with 99. Now, does this virtual Grand Prix really matter in the grand scheme of things? No, not really. But it did put George's name out there, and it got him some pretty good publicity. Was he gonna repeat a first place performance in the Williams? No, not with their car. But the virtual championship, it kind of struck this idea that maybe he could in a better car. Now it's July, and we're finally back to the tracks, with some new COVID restrictions in place. And Williams is disastrously slow. And any pace they thought that they got in practice at the beginning of the season has disappeared. Now, despite this, George and his teammate Nicholas were reconfirmed for the 2021 season, and team principal Claire, she was holding on tight. Now, before the 2020 season ended, we saw one last thing that was absolutely amazing and gut-wrenching come from George, and this was his moment in the Mercedes W11 during the Sakir Grand Prix when Lewis was positive with COVID-19. Now, coming in as a substitute driver, he had support from both Toto and Claire. We saw George Russell fight his way to the front of the grid in quali, finishing at P2, his absolute best. And he was like overtaking his, temporary teammate Bottas on the circuit multiple times to like try and cinch that P1 during the Grand Prix Sunday. This is where I just got gut-wrenched because really he lost due to two things. The Mercedes pit stops fumbled the bag, just absolutely fumbled it. And he also got a puncture. Now, George ended the race in P9. There was some tears. But you know what? There was also a lot of praise, like from literally every single person in the Mercedes garage, including Toto, who was stated saying, "I would say a new star is born." I honestly think that this was the race that confirmed a future for George in the Mercedes garage, especially with his maturity and like how he handled the loss, because he ended up that season in P18. Finally, this is 2021 and we have a season where Williams is bringing in those points, and we brought out the FW43B. And this was a car that would finally get in the midfield and maybe see a spot in Q2. We also had George. He was back better than ever. He actually started going to therapy because of just like the tough time he was having with Williams and, that moment with Mercedes where he almost had a P1. And he admitted that he was just a big supporter of mental health because, like he says, your mind is the most powerful tool in your body. And you know what? That therapy helped because this season we saw Williams finally in the points. I mean, George was claiming top 10 positions in Hungary, in Italy, and Russia. And there was this really strange but lovely podium in Belgium during an absolute tsunami of a weekend. I mean, he lost the maiden pole to Max, but it was like this seriously drenched quali. And he had a pretty nice stroll for P2 because he got P2 in the Grand Prix after it was called off due to the weather, and they only went in for like 3 laps. But you know what? Like George says, we'll take it. Williams needed that. We also witnessed something this season that I think was maybe just blown out of proportion because of what was happening off the circuit, but we witnessed a crash between Bottas and George during the Imola Grand Prix. And this is the collision where you see George like running up to Bottas' car and you're like, oh, he's going to check on him. No, he was absolutely fuming and like even tapped Bottas on the helmet for supposedly causing the crash. And Bottas in response is like, he couldn't hear him, so he's just seen flicking him off. Obviously, as a man with plans to hopefully drive for Mercedes, this wasn't the scene that, we wanted to see. But besides a little reprimanding from Toto about maturity in the news articles, it all seemed to be bygones. They moved on from it. George tried calling Valtteri, and then, he didn't pick up the phone because he said he was sleeping. But he's like, I don't care. We don't need to have a call. It's cool. It happens. And the stewards did decide it was, a pure accident. There was no one at fault. However, this news, I think, was just spicy because there was rumors that George was going to be taking Bottas' seat for the 2022 season. Now, while Russell may have started the season saying in a bunch of new articles, he was like, no, I'm not going to Mercedes. My focus is on Williams. It would be disrespectful to put my focus on Mercedes. We know the truth, okay? And come September, it's not even the end of the season, we had Mercedes announcing that George Russell would be joining Lewis Hamilton for the 2022 season, and Bottas was sadly out of there. Now, while he may have finished the 2021 season with Williams at P15, George actually already knew his fate before the season was even over, because right before the Belgian Grand Prix, his little podium stint, he was at dinner and the music was blasting. It was really loud. And he gets this call from Toto, and Toto thinks he's at a club. He's like, no, dude, I'm at dinner. And by the end of the call, George admits that he knew that he was going to be with Mercedes. And Melissa is actually going to tell us how that's going for him.
So in 2022, we saw George join the Mercedes AMG Petronas F1 team, replacing Valtteri Bottas and pairing up with the 7-time, if you ask me, 8-time world driver champion Lewis Hamilton. This was a lovely start, as we like to call them, to Britsades. In his first race as a Mercedes driver, George qualified 9th and finished in 4th at the Bahrain Grand Prix. We saw George take his first podium at the Australian Grand Prix, where there we saw him start from 6th place and finish in 3rd. As the races went on, we saw George finish in the top 5 and even more podium finishes. Hello, Mr. Consistency, or as others like to call him, Mr. Saturday. During the 2022 British Grand Prix, we saw the consistency come to a halt, unfortunately. George was involved in a first lap crash with Zhou and other drivers. At the incident, we all saw George get out of his car and run straight to the crash site to ensure Zhou was okay and to call the marshals over. Even though George was planning on rejoining the race, he was ultimately forbidden to rejoin due to the car being brought back by the track marshals and not under its own power. After the race, we witnessed George hold up to his nickname again, and at the Hungarian Grand Prix, George earned his maiden pole position. George was only 0.044 seconds ahead of Carlos Sainz. He was able to lead some of the race, but eventually got overtaken by Max and Lewis and finished the race in 3rd. By the end of the Dutch and Italian Grand Prix, George was 16 points adrift of 2nd place in the Drivers' Championship. At the Singapore Grand Prix, due to some weather changes and tire changes, George wasn't able to keep up the pace and finish just outside of the points. In Dakota for the United States Grand Prix, we saw an incident between George and Carlos where Carlos sadly DNF'd, and George did later apologize to Carlos and describe the race as his worst Sunday of the season. For the Sao Paulo Grand Prix, we saw George not only win the sprint race, but he got his maiden victory and the first and only win for Mercedes of the season. By the end of the 2022 season, George finished in 4th in the Drivers' Championship with 275 points. George continues to drive for Mercedes for the current 2023 season. However, it hasn't been the best start for the team or the driver himself. From the start of the season, George had said Red Bull should win every race this season. George has been on the podium once with his teammate Lewis at the Spanish Grand Prix. We're just about halfway through the season, so we'll see where George ends up in the championship by the end of the season. However, George currently stands at 6th place with 82 points. Also, George and Mercedes recently extended his contract with the team until 2025 after signing an already long-term deal for the 2022 season.
Now we know what George has done on the track. I'm going to talk a little bit about what he does off the track.
And one of the things I found really interesting when I was just kind of searching up his history with, Formula One was when Russell actually replaced Grosjean as the GPDA director. I didn't mention this, but it was during his years in Williams. It was 2021, and George actually became the director. It's the Grand Prix Drivers Association. And I was curious because I know he had to make a statement recently with Silverstone and the protesters. So I just want to share this in case you didn't know. But the main focus for the GPDA is they're basically like a union for the drivers. And their main concern is usually safety. But besides that, drivers can bring any major concerns to the association for review. And then the GPDA is like a middleman to the FIA. Now, I found it interesting. Not every driver has to be a member, by the way. It's all voluntary. It is encouraged. But Sebastian and Kimi, both of them have actually opted out in the past. And I thought that was kind of cool that George is one of the directors because like I said, I feel like he has that PR thing going for him. So it makes sense to me.
Yeah, and a little less serious of some off-track George life. Does anybody else miss George's Twitch era? Because I for sure miss just the Twitch quartet in general, but sometimes I'll still pop on George doing the oh my god, what was it? It's an 18-wheeler game where he's playing with Charles, and it's the funniest thing in the world because everyone on the people just start joining the server and then they all block them, and it's just the funniest thing to watch them just panic drive trucks. It's hilarious if you haven't watched it.
So I wasn't into Formula One or anything, so I didn't know anything about the Twitch quartet till like a bunch of TikTok videos came up on my feed and I enjoy them. But one of the videos I seen, it's like they're all playing and I don't know who it was out of the other three between Charles, Alex, and Lando, but they called George the goat. And like George is like, what are you talking about? Like the goat, like something about milking a goat. And they're like,
Oh, no. They were so they were talking about playing a goat simulator game, and George is like, "What do you mean a goat? Do you milk the goat?" And then Lando just gets furious that no one knows what a goat simulator is, and he's like, "No, you don't milk the blah, blah, blah." He's just like yelling because it's easy to get Lando angry. So it was just like that. It's hilarious. But yeah, it was George, Lando, Charles, and Alex. Those four. The full streams are online still.
yeah, I'm gonna have to look it up because like you literally hear like just George is like, what goat? Like, and then my mind, like I process it as like greatest of all time. So I thought they were joking around about like whatever game they were playing, but it's just, like you said, you hear Lando like getting annoyed and upset, and like the other two are just like laughing their heads off. But yeah, no, I would really appreciate that to come back. It'll give me some off-season entertainment at least.
So I don't know if any of you guys saw this a while back. The Sunday Times did a little profile. I totally forgot about this. They did a really sweet little profile on George Russell and his dad. And like some of the comments that his dad like said are so funny. He was saying that he was a bit of a comedian and that he and his wife knew that George was going to be a racing driver by the time George was 2 because and he was like basically born on the track. He went to races to watch his brother and help out in the garage. He actually had a toy tractor that he rode around the pit lane in, and he collected stickers from each race to stick on his George Russell racing tractor. It's the cutest thing. And one other thing was when we were talking about his incident with Valtteri, where he got out of the car and he was like fuming. His dad says there was one occasion when George failed his first driving test at 17 because he thought that being a great driver on the track was good enough. And he came home fuming that the examiner was wrong and they had to go back to the test center in Kingsland so George could confront him. And it's just, the whole profile is great. There was one thing that I think his dad said that he literally had all of his like trucks organized by color. Like he's just been so organized. It's really, really sweet. It's so funny to like get that inside like view kind of how he is at home and how he's been and how he was growing up.
I also love that he had to go confront someone when Max went to confront him after a race and he just didn't give in.
That was such a moment for me. I just remember seeing it and like all I could think about was like my problems, aka Max, and like me being George and walking away from them. But that just shows his little like IDGAFOS attitude where he was just like, it is what it is, and just like walked away. But it was an iconic moment.
I found the little thing I wanted to. They have a little like strange habits at the bottom, and George on his dad. He says that his dad will watch him race on live TV and then he'll rewatch the highlights the same day. I think that's so sweet. And then his dad said, this is what it was. He lines all of his shoes and shirts up in color order, just like he did with his toy tractors as a boy. It's so cute. Truly an Aquarian king. I do remember when we were talking about how well PR trained George seems, there was part in this article where he says that his mom made sure that he was brought up with manners, and like they were never actually like super wealthy. And so the one thing his mom wanted to make sure was that he had proper manners. And I think that's why he's so British and posh seeming. That and his wardrobe.
That's what I was going to say earlier and I forgot. I love that George, he curses once in a while, but like his main go-to is mostly things like sugar honey iced tea. And I'm just like, you know what, George, that's why I like you. Because you keep this PG-13 for all the little kid fans.
I love it when he says his little like blimey or crikey. It's just so cute. I sometimes feel like people outside of like the UK, like in general, don't get that British humor that he has, or don't get that saying those sayings, and then like blow it out of proportion. Because like what comes to mind instantly is like that moment last year in the last season when he was behind like Mick and he saw Mick driving for his life. He was like, crikey, Mick's out here like driving for his life or something like that. And people were like, now you know like how it is and everything. I'm like, but to me it sounded like he was complimenting Mick. And it always happens. I don't know. It just kind of like always annoys me because like I'm like, maybe it's just the way George says it in his personality where it's just like, it's okay. It's okay.
I've noticed that, at least with like other drivers, while I was doing the research and stuff, George has like small little issues with people, but it all seems like miscommunication. That's what I noticed when I was looking at the people he's fighting with. The only one that threw me off was Botas, because I was like, since when does this man go off like that? And he went running at him.
I mean, he even made sure to apologize to Carlos at least after that one race. So I mean, that says something about him. But again, it's just like sometimes like he'll say one thing and people just like take it like a completely like different route. And I'm just like, he could have like meant the other way or like maybe not like this, maybe like that. I don't know. I'm the type of person like I always like look at like multiple sides of like whatever a person says and a strong believer of like it's not what you say, it's how you say it. But that's George. It's his little posh self that we all love. But you guys had mentioned earlier about him going to therapy and being an advocate for mental health. I really, really, really love that he's been doing that and, posting about like different things and everything. Because I just feel like, especially among men and in sports, especially as one as tough and grueling as F1, like no one really speaks out about it. So it's nice to see someone with a young face on a big team like he is doing what he's doing and being like, it's okay. Go get help. It's all right. It's totally normal. Like, I don't know. It's just like little things I really appreciate that he speaks out about.
I agree. I think it's really important. I'm a huge advocate in general for therapy. I think everyone should go to therapy at least at some point in their life. I've been in therapy for a while, and I really love that he's doing that. And I know he had like a little campaign that he posted about like a month or two ago, I think. That was really great. And it's just really nice to see someone that high profile, like you said, like that high profile, like really advocate for it. I feel like especially in such a high stress and high profile job in life, like Formula One, those drivers, I know that it can get really intense. And I feel like having therapy as an outlet is really helpful. And especially in that kind of situation. Especially because they're traveling so much too, that has to take a toll on you mentally, not getting to see your family, not really slowing down. Like, that's a lot.
And you can tell he's a big family man. I don't know if you guys seen that video from over the weekend on the fan stage from the British GP, where like his niece and nephew come out and they're like all decked out like in George Russell merch. It's like the cutest thing. But you can tell like he's very much about his family. Even like on his Instagram, he had posted a picture like in a cuddle puddle with his like nieces and nephews. And like again, we mentioned in our recap episode, like whenever we see the drivers with the kids, it's like a very like wholesome moment. But you can definitely tell like he loves his family and loves spending any moment with his loved ones. But I thought it was funny, like his niece was like about to air out something about like the strategy, and then George is like, be careful, Millie, like there's people recording, and you just hear like, okay, put the mic down.
Children have no filter. They will say anything. Anything. But that video is so sweet and so cute. You can tell he really cares about and loves his family and his niece and his nephew. I have a nephew and I would do anything for him. I love him so much. So I can imagine he's the same way. And he is a big family man. He mentioned in the article I was talking about that when he found out when Claire Williams offered him a deal for Williams, his parents were the first people he told and they all cried, which is so sweet. And I think at one point he's mentioned before that I think his sister helps manage a lot of his like F1 stuff. And I believe he also mentioned that she does still call him by his nickname that she used to call him when they were children, which is, I believe, Georgie Porgy. And it's so funny to me to just think about her being in the garage and just calling him that. I feel like that's just so funny to me.
I like to call him Georgie Porgy from time to time, just for fun. But when you mentioned the crying, Another thing that I like about him, he's not afraid to show his emotion on camera. Like when he won, he was in tears. When he got his first points in Williams, he was in tears. Like I'm a Scorpio. I'm a very emotional person, so I will cry at any given like moment. And to see him like that and just not be afraid, I love it. It's nice.
I love that we were just talking about George as just a family guy, because it truly, like, he really is. And that kind of ties in with our pre-outro, which is a driver quote this episode. And that quote is, "I'm a typical British boy with big dreams," which a family guy, that really is just a typical British boy. And he's living his dream. I mean, Rachel said he's been running around on those paddocks since he was a kid, just in a little tyke truck. So I think that quote just really sums up George. That wraps up today's episode, and I really love my Brits. What was your favorite George moment? Let us know on our socials. Everywhere we are at Paddock Girls Podcast. Unless you're on Twitter, there we are at Paddock Girls Pod. Thank you for joining us in the paddock. See you next time. Bye, Craig.
Bye, Craig.
Bye, Craig.
Bye, Craig.